Sure you are, ma'am.
I'm a federal magistrate judge, Northern District of Georgia.
Then hands on the vehicle right now.
This is my judicial ID.
There's no reason.
I'm asking you to verify my...
Picture this. You arrest a black woman at a gas station. Ignore her when she tells you she's a federal judge. Laugh in her face. Book her anyway. Then 36 hours later, you walk into court for your own civil rights trial, and she's the one wearing the robe. That's exactly what happened to Forsyth County deputies Dominic Augustine and John Mueller. And what they didn't know was that Judge Sarah Blacksmith had just spent the worst night of her life saying goodbye to her dying mother. If you're ready to see institutional racism taken down, like this video and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Let me know if you enjoyed this story. And if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now because you won't want to miss how these deputies went from laughing at a gas pump to facing a federal courtroom. Now, let's see how a federal magistrate judge ended up handcuffed at a Circle K and how two deputies ended up facing her in court the very next morning. Sarah Blacksmith wasn't expecting to spend Saturday night in a jail cell. At 47 years old, the federal magistrate judge for the Northern District of Georgia had spent 23 years building a reputation for fairness, precision, and unshakable composure. She presided over drug conspiracies, immigration hearings, complex federal litigation. She'd stared down cartel lawyers and DOJ prosecutors without flinching. But at 2:17 a.m., on a cold February morning, none of that mattered. The ICU family waiting room at Piedmont Atlanta Hospital smelled like industrial cleaner and burnt coffee. Sarah sat in a vinyl chair that squeaked with every shift of weight, her mother's favorite blanket folded across her lap. Dr. Phillips had just delivered the words with careful, practiced compassion. Hours, maybe a day, the cancer had won. Evelyn Blacksmith, age 71, former elementary school teacher, church choir director, and the woman who'd worked 2 jobs to send her daughter to Howard Law, was slipping away. Sarah hadn't cried yet. She'd learned early in her legal career that tears were a luxury she couldn't afford in courtrooms, where every gesture was scrutinized, every emotion weaponized. But sitting alone in that waiting room, watching the second hand of the wall clock drag itself forward, something cracked open inside her chest. She had thrown on the first clothes she could find 18 hours earlier when the hospital called. Black leggings, an old Howard Law sweatshirt with a fraying collar, white sneakers. Her hair, usually pinned in a neat bun beneath her judicial robes, hung loose around her shoulders. No makeup. No jewelry except the small gold cross her mother had given her at law school graduation. She looked nothing like the federal judge who'd sentenced a corrupt police chief just 3 weeks earlier. The memory surfaced unbidden. Sarah had been 12 years old, sitting in the back of her mother's Buick after a traffic stop in rural Georgia. The officer had made Evelyn step out of the car, made her open the trunk, made her explain why she was driving through a white neighborhood. Sarah had watched her mother's hands shake as she produced her teacher's ID, her voice steady even as humiliation burned in her eyes. That memory had shaped everything. Law school, the bar exam, every case she'd ever presided over. And now, leaving the hospital at 1:43 a.m., the fuel light blinked, insistent and unforgiving on the dashboard of her Mercedes. She took the exit for Forsyth County, the GPS guiding her to a Circle K off GA 400, its fluorescent lights cutting through the February darkness like cold knives. The gas station sat isolated at the edge of the highway, an island of harsh white light surrounded by empty fields. A Waffle House glowed amber in the distance. Sarah pulled up to pump 7, the engine ticking as it cooled, and stepped out into air that smelled faintly of diesel and winter. She unscrewed the gas cap, swiped her card, began pumping. Her mind replayed the hospital room, her mother's labored breathing, the machines that beeped and hissed, the nurse who'd squeezed her shoulder and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. Headlights swept across the lot. Sarah glanced up. A patrol car circled slowly, deliberately, its movements predatory and assessing. It completed one full loop before pulling in behind her Mercedes, blocking her exit. 2 deputies stepped out. The first was tall, mid-40s, with a crew cut and a jaw that looked carved from stone. His nameplate read, Augustine. The second was younger, softer around the middle, his hand resting on his belt near his taser. Mueller. Augustine approached with a flashlight, the beam lancing directly into Sarah's eyes. She raised a hand to shield her face. The pump clicked off behind her. Augustine stopped 3 feet away, his flashlight steady, his expression flat. Mueller flanked him to the right, silent and watchful. Sarah reached for her wallet, moving slowly, deliberately. She extracted her federal judicial credentials, the laminated card catching the fluorescent light, and held it up between two fingers. The credentials identified her clearly. Federal Magistrate Judge Sarah Blacksmith, Northern District of Georgia. Her voice was calm, measured, the same voice she used to swear in witnesses. Augustine's eyes flicked to the ID, then back to her face. Then he laughed. It wasn't a chuckle. It was a full, open laugh, the kind that carried across empty parking lots. He turned to Mueller, gesturing at the credentials still held between Sarah's fingers. The mockery was evident in the curl of his lip, the casual dismissal in his posture. Mueller grinned, said nothing. Sarah kept her hand extended, the credentials still visible. Her offer to provide additional identification, her bar card, the clerk's office number for verification, hung in the air between them. Augustine stepped closer, his boots scraping against the concrete. His instruction was clear, hands on the vehicle. Sarah's assertion of her rights, her statement regarding the lack of reasonable suspicion, fell on ears that had already decided. The deputy's response was immediate, hands on the vehicle. Now. Sarah's pulse thrummed in her ears, but her hands remained steady. She placed her credentials back in her wallet, set the wallet on the hood of her car, and turned slowly, placing her palms flat against the cold metal. Mueller moved in, his hands swift and impersonal as he patted her down. The search was thorough, invasive, conducted under the unblinking eye of the gas station's security camera. Across the lot, a figure stood outside the Waffle House, watching. Augustine declared her under arrest for suspicious activity. Sarah's observation that suspicious activity wasn't a criminal charge went unacknowledged. The charge shifted to resisting. Her factual statement that she hadn't resisted made no difference. Augustine pulled her arms behind her back. The handcuffs clicked into place, cold and tight, the metal biting into her wrists. Sarah recited the words silently, a mantra, an anchor. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated. They walked her to the patrol car. Mueller opened the rear door. Sarah bent her head and climbed inside, the seat hard plastic, the space reeking of sweat and disinfectant. As Augustine closed the door, he turned to Mueller, raised his hand. High five. The sound was sharp and triumphant, captured by the Ring doorbell camera mounted on a post near the Waffle House entrance, recording silently in the night. The Forsyth County Detention Center was a squat concrete building that smelled like mildew and industrial soap. Sarah was processed at 3:11 a.m., fingerprinted, photographed, her belongings cataloged and sealed in a plastic bag. The holding cell was 8 feet by 10, a metal bench bolted to the wall, a toilet in the corner with no seat. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed incessantly, a mechanical whine that drilled into her skull. She sat on the bench, her wrists still aching from the cuffs, and waited. At 4:32 a.m., a corrections officer appeared at the bars. He didn't look at her as he spoke. Sarah followed him to a phone mounted on the wall in a narrow hallway, picked up the receiver. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, female, strained. Nurse Jacobs from Piedmont, Atlanta. The apology came first, automatic and hollow. Then the words that mattered. Evelyn Blacksmith had passed at 4:09 a.m. The words landed like stones. Sarah closed her eyes. The hallway tilted. She gripped the receiver until her knuckles went white. Her whispered thanks was barely audible. The call ended. The officer escorted her back to the cell. She sat on the bench and stared at the concrete floor, her mother's face vivid and unbearable behind her eyelids. At 6:15 a.m., a different officer arrived. Release paperwork. Credentials verified. No apology, no explanation. Sarah collected her belongings, signed the release form, and walked out into the gray pre-dawn light. Her car had been towed. The impound fee was $175, paid with the credit card she'd used to buy gas 7 hours earlier. She drove home in silence, the sunrise bleeding red and orange across the horizon, and collapsed onto her couch without undressing. Her phone buzzed at 9:43 a.m. Chief Judge Raymond Foster, Northern District of Georgia. The emergency was immediate. Judge Ellison had suffered a stroke. A civil rights case needed a presiding judge by Monday morning. Forsyth County Superior Court. Sarah was the only available magistrate. The case details were straightforward. Excessive force, wrongful arrest. The plaintiff was a young Somalian man. The defendants were 2 county deputies. A pause on the line. Dominic Augustine and John Mueller. Sarah said nothing. Her hand tightened around the phone. Foster's question hung in the air. Could she handle it? The answer came without hesitation, steady, unshakable. The same voice she'd used at the gas station, in the holding cell, on the phone with the nurse who told her that her mother was gone. She would handle it. Monday morning arrived cold and gray. Sarah entered the Forsyth County Superior Court through the judge's entrance at 7:45 a.m., her black robe pressed and immaculate, her hair pinned in its usual neat bun. The courthouse smelled like old wood and floor polish, the kind of building that had seen decades of justice attempted, delivered, or denied. The courtroom was packed, gallery seats filled with reporters, activists, community members. The case had drawn attention weeks before Sarah's involvement. Malik Fatah versus Deputies Augustine and Mueller. Excessive force, civil rights violations. The kind of case that made local news and sparked protests. Sarah took her seat behind the bench, arranged her files, and surveyed the room with the same measured composure she brought to every proceeding. The court reporter settled into position. The bailiff stood ready. At 8 o'clock, Sarah addressed the court on the record. Her disclosure was clear and procedural. 36 hours prior, she had been wrongfully arrested by the defendants in this case, Deputies Dominic Augustine and John Mueller, at a gas station in Forsyth County. The arrest had been without probable cause. She had been detained, booked, and released after verification of her judicial credentials. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Reporters scribbled frantically. Activists leaned forward. Sarah continued without pause. She cited legal precedents establishing that personal experience with defendants did not automatically constitute bias requiring recusal. She referenced cases where judges had presided over matters involving individuals with whom they'd had prior negative interactions, provided the judge could maintain impartiality. She noted that her arrest, while relevant for disclosure, did not affect her ability to apply the law objectively to the evidence presented. She invited objections. Defense counsel was given the opportunity to move for recusal. The defense attorney, a thin man in an ill-fitting suit, rose slowly. His motion was predictable. Conflict of interest, appearance of impropriety, the usual arguments. Sarah denied the motion. Her reasoning was methodical, anchored in case law and procedural standards. The trial would proceed. At 8:15, the side door opened. Dominic Augustine and John Mueller entered the courtroom in their dress uniforms, medals polished, shoes gleaming. They walked with the confidence of men who'd faced administrative reviews before and emerged unscathed. Then they saw her. Augustine stopped mid-stride, his face drained of color, the ruddy complexion turning pale and waxy. Mueller froze behind him, his mouth opening slightly, then closing. Recognition hit them like a freight train. The woman they'd handcuffed at the Circle K. The woman they'd laughed at. The woman they'd booked on false charges while her mother died. She was wearing the robe. Sarah met their eyes with the same calm expression she'd worn when they'd shone the flashlight in her face. No anger, no satisfaction. Just the neutral, professional gaze of a federal magistrate prepared to do her job. The deputies took their seats at the defense table, their movements stiff and mechanical. Jury selection began. By 10:30, the jury was impaneled. 12 citizens of Forsyth County, 8 women, 4 men, 7 white, 3 black, 2 Somalian immigrants. The plaintiff's attorney, a sharp woman named Rebecca Thorne, delivered her opening statement with precision. She outlined the case methodically. March 15th of the previous year. Malik Fatah, age 23, Somalian immigrant, college student, driving home from his shift at a grocery store. Traffic stop by deputies Augustine and Mueller. Alleged broken taillight, escalation, excessive force, injuries requiring hospitalization, a pattern of behavior targeting black and Somalian residents in Forsyth County. The defense's opening was predictable, officer safety, compliance issues, standard procedures followed. At 11:15, Malik Fatah took the stand. He was slight, soft-spoken, his English accented but clear. He described the night in detail, the flashing lights behind him. The fear that gripped him immediately, the kind of fear born from stories passed down in immigrant communities about interactions with police. He had pulled over, kept his hands visible, complied with every instruction. Augustine had approached his window, shone a flashlight in his face, asked where he was coming from, where he was going, why he was in this neighborhood. Malik had answered every question, produced his license, registration, insurance. Augustine had ordered him out of the vehicle. Malik had complied. The pat-down had been aggressive. When Malik had flinched at the rough handling, Augustine had interpreted it as resistance. Mueller had moved in. Between them, they'd forced Malik face down on the pavement, knee pressing into his back, handcuffs biting into his wrists. The takedown had resulted in a fractured rib, contusions, a concussion from his head striking the asphalt. The arrest report had listed resisting arrest and assaulting an officer. All charges had been dropped 3 weeks later. Rebecca Thorne introduced evidence methodically, dashcam footage showing the traffic stop, grainy but clear enough to see Malik's compliance and the deputy's escalation, medical records documenting his injuries, photographs of the bruises, the swelling, witness testimony from other Somalian residents describing similar encounters, a pattern emerging, targeted stops, aggressive tactics, arrests on vague charges that rarely stuck. At 2:30 p.m., during a brief recess, a man in a Waffle House uniform approached the plaintiff's table. He identified himself as Douglas Reed, night cook. He had footage. Rebecca Thorne moved to admit new evidence, a Ring doorbell video from the Waffle House near the Circle K gas station. Sarah reviewed the footage in chambers. Her own arrest, captured from across the lot, the high five between Augustine and Mueller as she sat handcuffed in the patrol car. The defense objected. Relevance. Prejudicial impact. Sarah overruled. The footage established a pattern of conduct. It was admissible under federal rules of evidence as proof of motive, opportunity, intent, and absence of mistake. The video played on the courtroom monitors at 3 o'clock. The gallery watched in silence as Sarah's arrest unfolded on screen. Her credentials ignored, her calm assertions dismissed, the handcuffs, the pat-down, the casual cruelty of the high five. The jury's reaction was visible. Tightened jaws, narrowed eyes. 2 jurors shook their heads. Do you think these deputies deserve what's coming? Drop a justice served in the comments if you agree, or share why you think reform is overdue, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. At 3:30, Rebecca Thorne called John Mueller as an adverse witness. Mueller took the stand reluctantly, his uniform suddenly looking too tight. His testimony began defensively. Standard procedures. Officer safety protocols, reasonable suspicion. Thorne's cross-examination was surgical. She walked him through the Malik Fatah incident, the dashcam footage, the medical evidence, the discrepancies between the arrest report and the video evidence. She introduced another piece of evidence, bodycam footage from Mueller's own camera, footage that had been deliberately corrupted in the original evidence submission. Digital forensics had recovered it. The footage showed Malik compliant, showed the excessive force clearly, showed Augustine's knee on Malik's back, Mueller's hands wrenching his arms upward. Mueller's composure cracked. Thorne pressed. Other arrests. Other incidents of deleted or corrupted footage. The pattern was undeniable. Then she asked about quotas, unofficial targets for arrests in certain communities. Mueller's face flushed red. His answers became halting, evasive. Sarah intervened, reminding him of his oath. The truth came out in fragments, then in a flood. Augustine had set targets, stops of black residents, Somalian immigrants specifically, pressure to maintain numbers, to justify patrols in certain neighborhoods. Mueller admitted to deleting footage, to falsifying reports, to following Augustine's lead because it was easier than pushing back. And then, in a moment that silenced the entire courtroom, he admitted to knowing who Sarah was when they arrested her, recognizing her credentials, making the arrest anyway because Augustine had laughed it off, because a black woman at a gas station at 2 a.m. couldn't possibly be a federal judge. Rebecca Thorne let the admission hang in the air. Then she asked one more question. Mueller's answer opened a door no one had anticipated. Augustine's father, former Sheriff Daniel Augustine, a name that meant something in Forsyth County, a legacy of law enforcement spanning 40 years, and a history of similar conduct. Mueller had heard the stories. An incident in 1978. A Somalian woman arrested on vague charges, held overnight. No formal charges filed. The woman's family had left the county shortly after. The connection crystallized. Sarah's grandmother, Amina Blacksmith, immigrant, wrongfully detained by Daniel Augustine. The event that had shaped Sarah's mother's distrust of law enforcement, that had driven Sarah toward the law. The courtroom erupted. Sarah gavelled for order, her voice cut through the chaos, steady and authoritative. She addressed the revelation on the record. The connection between Daniel Augustine's actions and Sarah's family history was disclosed. She ruled it irrelevant to the question of recusal. Her impartiality was based on her ability to apply the law to the evidence, not on personal history unrelated to the current case. The trial would continue, but something had shifted. The pattern wasn't just recent, it was generational, systemic. Augustine sat at the defense table, his face rigid, his hands clenched into fists. The chapter ended with Sarah recessing court for the day, her gaze steady on the deputies as they filed out. Augustine's testimony would come tomorrow. Tuesday morning began with a courtroom even more packed than the day before. Word of Mueller's confession and the generational connection had spread. Local news vans lined the street. Activists gathered on the courthouse steps. At 9 a.m., Dominic Augustine took the stand. He wore his uniform with rigid precision, every crease sharp, every metal aligned. His jaw was set, his eyes defiant. He had the bearing of a man who'd faced accusations before and weathered them through sheer force of will. His direct examination by defense counsel was predictable. Emphasis on officer safety, reasonable fear, split-second decisions, the difficulty of the job. At 10:15, Rebecca Thorne rose for cross-examination. Her approach was measured. She didn't rush. She built the foundation methodically. She walked Augustine through his training, his years on the force, his understanding of constitutional rights, Fourth Amendment protections, probable cause requirements. Augustine answered with practiced confidence. He knew the law. He'd followed it. Thorne introduced the dashcam footage again, played specific segments, asked Augustine to explain specific actions. His explanations grew more defensive, more circular. She introduced statistics, arrest rates in Forsyth County broken down by race and ethnicity. The numbers told a stark story. Black and Somalian residents were stopped at rates 4 times higher than white residents. Arrest rates were 6 times higher. Conviction rates were significantly lower, suggesting arrests without merit. Augustine dismissed the statistics. Correlations, population distribution, crime patterns. Thorne shifted tactics. She asked about Sarah's arrest, the credentials he'd seen, the dismissal of her identification, the high five captured on video. Augustine's confidence wavered. His answers became clipped, evasive. Thorne pressed. What was the legitimate basis for arresting a federal judge who'd identified herself and provided credentials? Augustine's response was telling. She'd matched the description. Suspicious activity, officer discretion. Thorne asked him to articulate the description. Augustine faltered. The description was vague. General, black woman, late at night, in that area. The implication was clear. Being black in Forsyth County at 2 a.m. was suspicious. Thorne pivoted to Malik Fatah, the traffic stop, the escalation. What made Malik suspicious beyond the alleged taillight? Augustine's answers grew more strained. Nervous behavior, failure to maintain eye contact, body language. Thorne played the dashcam footage again, slowed it down, pointed out Malik's compliance, his visible hands, his calm responses. She asked Augustine to explain the discrepancy. Augustine's facade began to crack. His voice rose. His gestures became more animated. Then Thorne asked the question directly. Was it department policy to target black and Somalian residents? Augustine's response was immediate, heated. Certain people didn't belong in Forsyth County, not unless they had a damn good reason to be there. The courtroom froze. Augustine seemed to realize what he'd said, attempted to walk it back, to clarify. But the words hung in the air, recorded by the court reporter, witnessed by the jury and the packed gallery. Rebecca Thorne thanked him for his honesty, sat down. The defense had no redirect that could undo that admission. At 11:30, Sarah made an unusual procedural decision. To ensure absolute fairness and eliminate any question of bias, she would temporarily step down from the bench. Senior Judge Thomas Brennan, called in from the Southern District, would preside over her testimony regarding her own arrest. The transition was seamless. Judge Brennan, 72, with 30 years on the federal bench, took his seat with practiced authority. Sarah was sworn in as a witness. Her testimony was factual, precise, devoid of emotion. She recounted the gas station stop, the display of her credentials, the dismissal of her identification, the arrest, the booking, the hours in the holding cell. She testified about the phone call, her mother's death while she was detained. The courtroom was silent. Defense counsel attempted cross-examination, suggested that her emotional state might have affected her perception of events, that grief might have colored her memory. Sarah's response was measured. Her credentials had been photographed during booking. The timestamps on the arrest record confirmed her timeline. The Ring doorbell footage corroborated her account. Her testimony was unshakable. Judge Brennan thanked her. She stepped down. He recessed court briefly, then Sarah resumed her position on the bench. The procedural dance was complete. Her testimony was on the record, overseen by a neutral party beyond reproach. Closing arguments began at 2 p.m. Rebecca Thorne's summation was powerful but controlled. She wove together the evidence, Malik's testimony, the medical records, the dash cam and body cam footage, the pattern of conduct, the statistical disparities, Mueller's confession, Augustine's damning admission. She emphasized the constitutional violations, Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable search and seizure, 14th Amendment guarantees of equal protection. She reminded the jury that this wasn't just about Malik Fattah, it was about a system that had operated with impunity for generations. From Daniel Augustine's wrongful arrest of Sarah's grandmother to Dominic Augustine's arrest of Sarah herself, the pattern had to end. The defense's closing was weaker. Appeals to officer safety, the difficulty of making split-second decisions, the dangers of the job. But the evidence was overwhelming. The video footage, the confessions, the overt racism captured on the stand. At 3:45 p.m., Sarah gave the jury their instructions. She outlined the legal standards, the burden of proof, the elements of the civil rights claims. The jury retired to deliberate at 4:15 p.m. They returned at 5:30 p.m., 1 hour and 15 minutes. The verdict was unanimous. Liability established on all counts. Excessive force, false arrest, violation of constitutional rights, deliberate indifference to training and supervision, extending to the department itself. Damages, $15 million. The gallery erupted in applause. Sarah gavelled for order but didn't suppress the reaction entirely. The moment deserved acknowledgement. Sarah issued her ruling on remedial measures the following morning. The Forsyth County Sheriff's Department would establish an independent civilian accountability board with subpoena power and authority to review all use of force incidents and arrests. Mandatory anti-bias training would be implemented immediately, with specific modules on immigrant rights and constitutional protections. Body cameras would be upgraded to models with tamper-proof storage, automatic upload, and severe penalties for corruption or deletion of footage. Deputies Augustine and Mueller were terminated immediately. Criminal referrals were filed with the U.S. Attorney's Office for civil rights violations under federal statute. The reforms were sweeping, the accountability mechanisms real. 3 months later, Sarah stood at her mother's grave. The headstone was simple. Evelyn Blacksmith. Beloved mother, teacher, and light. Sarah placed flowers at the base. Daisies. Her mother's favorite. She thought about her grandmother, Amina, arrested by Daniel Augustine in 1978. The event that had shaped everything. She thought about her own arrest, the circle that had closed in that courtroom. She thought about Malik Fattah, who'd reached out last week to say he was applying to law school, inspired by the trial, by the possibility of justice. John Mueller had resigned, moved to a different county, started working with a police reform nonprofit, teaching about the dangers of complicit silence. Dominic Augustine had been forced to relocate. No department would hire him. His father's legacy tarnished alongside his own. Forsyth County was changing, slowly, imperfectly, but changing. The Accountability Board had reviewed 80 cases in 3 months, found misconduct in 17, recommended discipline in 12. The message was clear. The old ways wouldn't be tolerated. Sarah had accepted the chair position on the board, oversight in addition to her judicial duties. It was extra work, but necessary. She drove past the Circle K on her way home that evening. A patrol car sat in the lot, a deputy filling out paperwork, a young Somalian man standing nearby, clearly just questioned, but relaxed. No handcuffs, no aggression. The deputy handed back the man's ID with a nod. The man got back in his car, drove away. A mundane interaction, respectful, constitutional. The way it should have always been. Sarah continued driving, the sunset painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The system wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it could be made to work, through persistent pressure, through accountability, through people willing to fight for it even when it meant fighting the system from within. Her mother had taught her that, her grandmother's experience had proven it necessary, and now the work continued, one case at a time, one reform at a time, one interaction at a time. Justice wasn't a destination, it was a practice, daily, deliberate, demanding. Sarah drove home as night fell over Forsyth County, the weight of the robe she'd worn that day settling into something like purpose. The story of deputies Augustine and Mueller had ended, but the work of building a more just system had only begun.
If you like this video, make sure to hit that like button subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. Share this video with someone who would appreciate it, and let's keep building this community together. And before you go, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what stood out to you the most. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next.